There's a note in an old Oklahoma case file that simply says, "We are on a mission to harm 3 girls in Tent 1. Now, 2 months later, 3 campers were found near Tent 8. The man blamed was captured, tried, and acquitted of all charges. Yet his fingerprint somehow appeared on a flashlight found at the scene, a flashlight that investigators admit they handled for days before testing. Decades later, one of his defense attorneys steps forward with new evidence, claiming that the proof that convicted him in the public's mind might actually have been planted. I'm John Genua. This is America's Strangest History. Pack your bags. We're headed to Camp Scott, more specifically, Tent 8. Before the night that changed everything, Camp Scott looked like the safest place in the world. The 1946 brochure promised excellent swimming, hiking, and crafts under friendly guidance. Stone gates marked the entrance. Trails wind through 400 acres of oak and hickory. For 50 years, it stood as the pride of the Oklahoma Girl Scouts. This is a place for songs around campfires and merit badges. In June 1977, 3 girls from Tulsa boarded a bus for their first week at camp. Lori Farmer, 8 years old, bright, meticulous, and the youngest camper that summer. Michelle Goose, 9, an avid reader, always with her camera, already dreaming of becoming a teacher. And Denise Milner, 10, friendly and cautious, was persuaded by her mother that camp would be an adventure. That evening, the girls unpacked inside Tent 8. It was the farthest tent from the counselor's quarters. It was hidden slightly by brush at the edge of the Kiowa unit. The girls wrote letters home before lights went out. The letter from Lori read, "We're in the last tent. It's kind of far from the others. I love you, Mommy." Michelle wrote, "I'm sending my letter out. It is my last one for now. Wish you could be here." Denise wrote, "I've made 3 new friends, Glenda, Lori, and Michelle, but the first day it rained. I don't like camp. I want to come home." Those were the last words their families ever received. The next morning, Tent 8 was silent. By sunrise, Camp Scott was closed forever. Rain fell hard through the night of June 12th. At dawn, the counselors began their usual routine, calling each tent to breakfast. When Carla Wilhite reached Tent 8, the flap hung open and inside looked disturbed. Bags were overturned and bedding appeared to have been dragged across the platform. Moments later, another counselor shouted from a nearby trail. 3 campers were found together under a small tree less than 200 yards from their tent. They were taken from Tent 8 sometime during the storm. Investigators later determined that the attack began inside the tent. The canvas showed tears and traces of blood. 2 of the girls had been restrained, and all 3 suffered blunt force trauma. Now, the state medical examiner concluded that the incident occurred between 2 and 4 in the morning while the rain was still falling. This key detail likely erased much of the physical evidence. Counselors quickly moved the remaining children to the dining hall, telling them that there had been some kind of emergency. They sang camp songs to drown out the sirens approaching from the highway. By noon, buses were rolling out of Camp Scott for the very last time. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation took over within hours. They photographed Tent 8, the trail, and every muddy footprint they could find around it. Among the items collected were lengths of rope, adhesive tape, and a red flashlight lying near the path. Now, inside the flashlight was a scrap of paper used to dim the light. A partial fingerprint was lifted, but it was too smudged for an identification. Search teams extended outward through the Cookson Hills, the dense forest, caves, and along miles of back roads. Now, within days, they found a small cave 2 miles from camp. Inside were women's purses, sunglasses, food wrappers, a roll of tape identical to the one at Camp Scott, and photographs of a local man named Gene Leroy Hart. Hart was a Cherokee citizen who escaped from jail 4 years earlier while serving time for burglary and abduction. He grew up less than 20 miles from Camp Scott and knew those woods better than anyone. To investigators, the cave proved he'd been there. To some locals, it proved only that someone wanted it to look that way. In the months that followed, authorities tied every clue back to Hart. I'm talking the footprint, the rope, the photographs, but later testimony would show how fragile that evidence really was. According to defense attorney Gary Pitchlynn, whose 2024 book, The Usual Suspect, re-examines the case, the flashlight passed through multiple hands before being logged. The partial fingerprint wasn't recorded until days later, after officers had already handled it without gloves. The hair sample that the state claimed matched Hart was compared only by sight under microscope. Now, modern experts say this method can't prove anything. What about the photographs found in the cave, right? They were official booking photos taken by the sheriff's office years earlier. Now, Pitchlynn asks, how could a fugitive hiding from police possess his own mugshots? Still, the public wanted an arrest. A year-long manhunt ended in April 1978 when Hart was captured in a cabin near Brushy Mountain. He was brought back to Mays County to stand trial. Before Gene Leroy Hart became the center of this case, he was already a wanted man. Born in 1943 in Locust Grove, just a few miles from Camp Scott, Hart grew up in a close-knit Cherokee family. He was a talented athlete, a high school football standout, and for a time, the pride of his small community. But in adulthood, something changed. In 1966, while working at a steel plant in Tulsa, Hart was arrested for abducting two young women by the parking lot of a nightclub called the Fond du Lac Club. He drove them out of town to a wooded area in Mays County, the same kind of rural terrain that would later define the Camp Scott investigation. Both women survived and identified Hart, and he pleaded guilty to kidnapping and assault. He received a 10-year sentence. He served only a portion of that term before being paroled. Now, just 3 years later, in 1969, police linked him to a string of nighttime burglaries across Tulsa. The crimes were unusual. He'd break into occupied homes while the residents were asleep, sometimes taking only small personal items like purses, wallets, eyeglasses. In one of those burglaries, he entered the apartment of an off-duty Tulsa police officer, Heather Campbell. Now, she woke up, she armed herself, and forced the intruder to retreat. Police arrested Hart soon after. They found property from several burglaries in his car. A district court judge sentenced him to 300 years in prison. 4 consecutive 90-year sentences, citing his prior convictions and the fear he caused. In 1973, Hart escaped from the Mays County Jail. He vanished into the Cookson Hills. This is the area of rough country that once sheltered outlaws like Pretty Boy Floyd. He managed to elude law enforcement for 4 years, but in the small Cherokee community scattered throughout those hills, people started whispering that Hart was still there. He was living off the land, sheltered by friends and relatives who believed that he'd been mistreated by the courts. When 3 campers lost their lives at Camp Scott, only 20 miles from where Hart was raised, investigators immediately saw a connection. A fugitive with a violent past, familiar with the terrain, and known to have hidden in the very woods that surrounded the camp. So when searchers found his mugshots, the official police photographs inside the cave near the scene, the narrative kind of wrote itself. To law enforcement, it was proof. To many Cherokee citizens, it was not. That's what made the manhunt for Gene Leroy Hart unlike any other in Oklahoma's history. On one hand, he was a dangerous man. He's a fugitive from the law with a history of violent behavior, finally being brought to justice. On the other hand, he was a symbol of how easily an accused man could become a convenient suspect. That divide between fear and loyalty, guilt and injustice would shadow everything that happened next. When the proceedings opened in March 1979, the courtroom overflowed. Prosecutors presented the rope, the flashlight, the hair, and the cave photos as proof. Pitchlynn and co-counsel Tom Ellis dismantled each piece. They showed broken chain of custody records, unsealed evidence bags. They pointed to conflicting forensic reports. Witnesses disagreed on details. Experts contradicted each other. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours before returning a verdict. Not guilty. Hart was returned to prison for his earlier convictions because he broke out of prison and been living on the lam for years. 2 months later, he collapsed during a morning jog and died of a heart attack. The case officially closed. Decades later, new DNA tests reopened the conversation. Samples from Camp Scott produced partial genetic profiles that pointed to multiple contributors. Hart couldn't be ruled out, but he also couldn't be confirmed. Then came new claims. Pitchlynn wrote of the other potential suspects, the Duffield brothers, Jimmy Brann, a man named Buddy Bristol, who reportedly confessed near the end of his life to knowing who was responsible. Cherokee journalist Faith Phillips later confirmed that statement through tribal sources. After the 2020 McGritt v. Oklahoma decision restored tribal jurisdiction over parts of eastern Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation investigators began reviewing the old files. For the first time in 40 years, the Camp Scott case is again being analyzed. this time under modern law and forensic technology. What happened at Camp Scott changed Oklahoma law enforcement forever. Evidence procedures were rewritten, communication between county, state, and federal agencies were overhauled. Yet the central question remains: who entered Tent 8 that night? The forensic trail points in several directions. Some say towards Hart, others to unknown accomplices. The DNA suggests there may have been more than one person. Camp Scott never reopened. Now the forest reclaimed the grounds. The dining hall collapsed years ago. The trails are overgrown and silent. Every time a new technique promises to extract another clue from the aging evidence, the files are opened once more and Oklahoma is reminded that 3 young campers wrote home from a place that was supposed to be safe. I'm John Genua. You've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.